Hi, my name is Joe Russo, and I'm one of the partners at the Granite Law Group. We practice personal injury in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, anything from catastrophic medical malpractice to simple motor vehicle accident cases. And what I wanted to do in this video is to explain to you some of the typical injuries that we see in motor vehicle cases. Because oftentimes there's some confusion about what people are suffering from, how to get the proper treatment, and most importantly, what you need in order to get a good paper trail to ultimately get reimbursed for the injuries that you sustained in a motor vehicle crash. And the three injuries that I really want to discuss and just break down some basic concepts about the mechanism of injury, the scope of the treatment, and what to expect for these types of injuries is number one, a spine injury, number two, torn rotator cuff, and number three, concussion. So generally speaking, what happens after a motor vehicle crash, whether it's a T-bone, rear ender, doesn't really matter, is you're going to have the opportunity to have an ambulance respond to the scene, assess you, and determine if you want to seek treatment at a local emergency room. We always recommend having the client go to a local emergency room for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're going to get good documentation. The ambulance run report is going to discuss how the accident happened, what your symptoms are right out of the gate. Same thing with the emergency room documentation, and it's just really good to collapse any gaps in treatment. So the sooner you're receiving treatment, the better it is for your case. Now, what's going to happen in the emergency room is all of your initial issues are going to be documented. They're not going to be appropriately diagnosed in the emergency room. Why? In an emergency room setting, they're doing triage. And what they're typically looking for is broken bones. They're going to be ordering x-rays. They're going to be ordering CT scans. So why do they do that? It's an issue with health insurance, to be quite frank with you. The health insurance companies don't want to pay for more sophisticated diagnostic imaging, such as an MRI, in an emergency room setting. And so really, the only thing that they're going to be doing in an emergency room setting is performing an emergency surgery. If you have a fracture, by way of example, that is displaced, meaning that the bone is offset, they're going to reset it, and typically they'll use surgical implants such as hardware to bring that bone in anatomical alignment. Otherwise, if it's a non-displaced fracture, simply what they're doing is casting you and having you follow up outpatient with one of your physicians. But the spine injury stuff, you want it documented. You want it documented whether or not the injury is to your cervical spine, your neck, your thoracic spine, the mid-back, or your lumbar spine, the lower back. But the imaging is not going to show any disc bulges or disc herniations. And everyone uses these terms in very loose language. Here's really what it means. So this would be an example of two vertebrae sections of the spine. So the vertebrae is the bone in the spine. This would be an example of the disc. Between each level of the vertebrae, there's going to be a disc. And if you look at the back of the spine, there's going to be a spinal cord that runs along the back of the spine, and at each level of the spine there's going to be nerve roots that branch out. Okay, so obviously the vertebrae is bone. It can't be moved. It's hard, but the disc material is softer, and so when your spine bends or flexes, it allows the vertebrae to bend and flex with those discs that are able to be not manipulated, but maneuvered in a certain way where there's fluidity to the motion in your spine. Now, the problem is when you sustain a severe whiplash injury, whether it's to your neck or your lumbar spine, that's typically the two areas where you see these types of injuries after motor vehicle crashes. These vertebrae are compressing, pushing down on the disc material. And what's going to happen sometimes is, and I don't, yep, you can see right here. So the disc material, if it's compressed too hard with a whiplash type injury, is going to protrude. It's going to bulge. It's going to herniate. And all things being equal, people deal with herniations on a daily basis after they reach a certain age. This is something that, generally speaking, after you reach 40, there are people that live with disc herniations, minor ones, and it doesn't cause too much of an impediment to their lives. But what really becomes a problem is if the herniation is so pronounced, it's sticking out so much that it's compressing on the nerve root. Okay, and here is how this gets diagnosed, and here is how this gets treated. So you undergo X-ray imaging or CT scan imaging of your spine in an emergency room if you're experiencing pain. 9 times out of 10, it's going to be negative, but you still experience symptoms. So after you're discharged from the emergency room, you go to your PCP. The PCP is going to first assume that it's a soft tissue spine injury. What does that mean? A soft tissue spine injury is the muscles that are protecting your spine constrict and contract. They need to be loosened up. So whether it's chiropractic adjustments, whether it's physical therapy, one of the two, muscle relaxant medications and so forth, that would treat a soft tissue injury. Typically you feel it the following day after the adrenaline has worn off, and you start to experience the pain in a much more impactful manner. Okay, so this is the red flag of a complaint that you could make to your PCP about a real serious spine injury: numbness and tingling. Okay, so the nerve roots that run from your cervical spine that are coming out of your neck are running down into your arms, into your fingers. The ones that are running down out of your lumbar spine are running down your legs and into your feet and toes. So what happens is when the disc is bulging or herniated so much that it's compressing that nerve root, the electrical signals from your brain are being disrupted, similar to a kink in a hose. And so if you have a disc bulge in your cervical spine, you're going to experience numbness and tingling in your hands and in your fingers. If you have a disc bulge in your lumbar spine that's pressing on the nerve root, again, you're going to experience numbness and tingling in your feet and in your toes. This is something called neuropathy or radiculopathy. So if you're making those complaints, doc, I got numbness and tingling in my hands, it won't go away, this is very weird, it's making me concerned, it's like a nerve pain. It's not like, it's hard to describe, but it's like, it's pins and needles, kind of like when your foot falls asleep, but in my fingers or in my toes. So that's a red flag to the doctor to order an MRI. So the difference between an MRI and an X-ray is the X-ray is just looking for broken bones. It's just observing the bones. The MRI uses very powerful magnets to be able to visualize soft tissues, okay? Not just the bone, but also the discs. And I know we're talking about spine right now, but in other parts of the body, the knee, the shoulder, it's showing ligaments. And what it does is the MRI is going to be able to demonstrate tears in the ligaments. It's also going to be able to demonstrate a disc bulge or herniation. You'll actually be able to see that bulge pushing out against the spinal cord. And so that's a very helpful tool in getting your injury diagnosed, because there's really no way of knowing that you have this injury unless you undergo an MRI. Why is that important for your case? Well, it jacks up the value of your case to a higher level. When insurance companies for auto carriers, when they evaluate the claim, they put different emphasis on different types of injuries. A soft tissue case is something that they don't value very high. You could, now it's really tricky, right? Because people could experience soft tissue injuries and treat for them for, years. But the insurance companies become very skeptical of these types of injuries. And in their system of when they're evaluating cases, and based on the data that they have, they typically see these injuries get resolved in 4 to 6 weeks. But if you have a positive MRI, it jacks up the level of your case. And now, after the MRI is positive, you're going to be referred to an orthopedic surgeon or a neurosurgeon. And there's two routes you can go with a spine injury such as this. There's conservative care, or there is surgical care. And conservative care is they could give you injections into the particular level of the spine. A lot of people aren't very keen on doing a treatment like that. There's pain management. And ultimately, if your symptoms don't resolve, there's several different surgeries that could be performed on the spine. If you could avoid a spinal surgery, and I'm sure your surgeon is going to agree, you should try to avoid it, because they're very complicated, especially when there's a fusion involved, which is using hardware to fuse several levels of the spine, and it really limits mobility, and it really causes some significant problems. These are very complex injuries. These are very valuable injuries when an insurance company is evaluating the case. And these are really tough quality of life injuries, and hopefully you don't have to experience anything like this. And so that's the spine. The other thing that you're typically going to experience is an injury to the shoulder. Okay? So generally speaking, when people are driving their car, they have their arms locked, elbows locked, and when they're struck, whether it's from the side, T-bone, from behind, they tense up at the moment of impact, and your body is thrust forward in a way that the joint of your shoulder gets disrupted. Okay? So when people come to me and say, my shoulder is killing me, the first thing I'm thinking is torn rotator cuff. Okay? So the seatbelt goes over the left shoulder. You typically see it in the left shoulder as opposed to the right shoulder. But you could still suffer a torn rotator cuff to the right shoulder if your body is thrust forward. But notwithstanding, you typically see it more on the left side, because when your body is pushed forward, the seatbelt catches and halts the momentum of your body and puts a lot of pressure right here on the left shoulder. And so when people come to me, and after several days after the accident, and they say, I can't raise my arm over my head without pain, I'm telling them you probably have some form of a torn rotator cuff. Like the disc herniation, the only way to get it diagnosed is with an MRI. And here is an anatomical exhibit of a human shoulder, and this is the rotator cuff. These supraspinatus tendons that travel from underneath the clavicle bone and encapsulate the humerus, which is the ball that goes into the socket. And the socket, you can't really see it from underneath here, is the labrum. So it's kind of like a cup holding the head of the humerus in place. So either there's going to be a torn tendon, what is typically referred to as a slap lesion, or there's going to be damage to the tissue in the cup, the labrum. And so for a shoulder surgery is definitely going to be less involved than a spinal surgery. Generally speaking, a shoulder surgery could be addressed arthroscopically. So an open incision is when the physician is actually cutting you open, expanding the tissue to go inside and perform surgical maneuvers. You're going to be left with a scar. The bigger the scar depends on how big the opening and how big the incision is, of course. With an arthroscopic surgery, it's less invasive. So they're making portal holes into the particular joint or area that they're going to be operated on, where they're inserting a camera, they're inserting a surgical instrument, and they're able to visualize what they're operating on, and what they're looking for is damaged tissue, damaged tendon. It's going to be frayed. It's not going to be healthy tissue. And they're shaving it down. So the remainder of the tissue is going to be healthy, and it's not going to give you pain if some of the torn tissue is just slightly shaved. So now you're left with solid tissue. That would be an example of an arthroscopic shoulder surgery. Now, the last injury we typically see is a concussion injury. A lot of people are under the misconception that you have to strike your head on something to sustain a concussion. That is not the case. So in a similar fashion to there's pressure on your cervical spine with a whiplash type mechanism of injury, your head is also being thrust back and forth. And inside your skull, there's cerebral spinal fluid that is encapsulating your brain to protect it. But when there's that very violent motion with your head, what's happening is your brain is striking the inside of your skull, which causes a concussion. Okay? Now, typically 9 times out of 10, maybe even 95 times out of 100, you will not see any evidence of a concussion when you go into an emergency room and undergo a CT. And even if you continue to experience concussion symptoms thereafter, even with an MRI, there's not all MRIs are created equal. They have different levels of how sensitive their magnets are. So if you don't have a brain hemorrhage, a brain bleed, that damage to your brain is typically not going to get picked up, even with an MRI. But you're still experiencing the symptoms. And what are the symptoms? I mean, everyone knows after hearing about CTE and concussions in youth sports, and there's been a lot of discussion about it in the past decade or so. Nausea, headaches, lack of short-term memory. Oftentimes there's an issue with your ability to control your emotions, sensitivity to light, sensitivity to sound, called photophobia or phonophobia. And generally speaking, so you really want to get these, you want to advocate on your own behalf when you're treating with your doctor, because the only way to get this stuff diagnosed is with your complaints, you telling the doctor, because there's no way of really testing for it, at least with the level of care that you're going to receive in your local community, is by saying, you know, doc, I experience really severe headaches, worse than I ever experienced before. My brain is very foggy. I'm having difficulty grasping words and articulating myself. I'm sleeping a lot. I'm forgetting things, etc. That gets documented into the record, and now it becomes part of your case. Insurance companies are typically very skeptical of concussion cases because it's only coming from the complaints of the client instead of some objective test like an MRI, like an X-ray, like a CT scan, or some of the other tests like an EMG, a nerve conduction study, things of this nature. So insurance companies are a little skeptical, but notwithstanding, concussion cases are pretty serious. And fortunately, the brain is able to heal itself, regenerate within a certain amount of time. If it's unable to do so, you will get diagnosed with something called post-concussion syndrome, which is a little bit worse. Concussion cases are tough. They're tough because if you suffer a true traumatic brain injury, I mean, it could be more valuable than any injury to a specific body part, such as a knee or a shoulder or even a spine, because it impacts every single aspect of your life, because it impacts the way you think, the way you operate in the world, the way you communicate, your profession, of course, your interpersonal relationships, etc. but it's very nuanced, and it's very difficult to bring to life unless you have the appropriate experts. So those are the three big injuries that you typically see in car accident cases. I hope this assists you in advocating on your own behalf when you're treating with your doctor. I always tell people, follow the doctor's orders. Don't just go to the doctor for the hell of going to the doctor. That's not the way we practice, and I'm not promoting it in any way, shape, or form. With that all being said, there are a lot of people, when they suffer an injury like this, especially if there's good insurance coverage, and typically it's oftentimes with the guys, I'm tough, rub some dirt on it. And the problem with that approach is you're leaving money on the table. And when it comes time to resolve your case, whoever's representing you is not going to be able to get the full value of the case because nothing is appropriately documented. And once that settlement happens, the case is done. You could learn that you have a severe injury that's going to impact you 10, 20 years down the road. You don't get a second bite at the apple. So if you suffered an injury like this in Massachusetts or New Hampshire, and you want to talk about your injuries, how to advocate, how to communicate with your physician, your surgeon, whatever, we would be happy to chat with you. My law firm is the Granite Law Group, and I'm going to put some contact information at the bottom of the video. Have a great day, happy holidays, and take care.